Oh, hi, everyone. This is Katie Chalice. I'm the privacy director at the Utah State Board of Education. Excited to be doing this little training for you today. So this is a recording of, or it's like a screencast of a training we did at the Student Data Privacy Fall Conference in November of 2023, sort of a trimmed down version of that presentation. So let's dive in. We're going to be talking about access control and offboarding staff. So first, let's get on the same page regarding access control. What is access control? Well, the way I put it is access control specifies which individuals have permission to access certain data or certain systems. And in some cases, you can even specify under what circumstances or conditions they have that access. What does this look like? Well, there's a couple of things that ways this might play out. One might be that some people aren't allowed into a system at all. Another example might be that multiple people are allowed into the same system, but some people are given certain access and some people are given greater or less access depending on their needs. All right, so let's dive into defining roles. You might be familiar with the term legitimate educational interest. That's a term that is used in FERPA. So this is kind of a fun little way to tie what might seem like a data security conversation to something that is more explicitly data privacy. And that is that when you are determining how much access an individual in your district or charter school can have, we recommend looking at it through a lens of a legitimate educational interest. So a legitimate educational interest refers to someone who needs the information to do their job. So they're an employee of the school district or charter school, or in some cases, they are acting on behalf of the school district or charter school, and they need the information to do their job. So let's talk as an example about some of these different roles. A school secretary will likely need access to at least some information about every single student in the school. This allows the school secretary to look up a kid when their parent comes to check them out from school, or help a principal when the principal needs to figure out what class a student is in. A teacher, but in contrast, is typically only going to need access, only has a legitimate educational interest in the student information for the students that the teacher teaches. Then we have the case of an IT director, where an IT director might need to have a huge amount of information about students all across the district or the charter, but their legitimate educational interest is different. They're going to need to be able to support a student when they are having trouble logging in, for example, or in some cases, an IT director might need to do investigations into, inappropriate use of the student's computer. So they need some of that deeper information. So obviously they will need greater access than perhaps a teacher or even a school principal. All right, so the rest of this presentation is going to just be a series of recommendations. These recommendations come from us, the student data privacy team, based on research we've done on best practices and that kind of thing. But there's also a lot of these recommendations that came straight from other school districts and charter schools. So things that they have found to be helpful when they're considering access controls and offboarding staff. So let's dive in. All right, so our first recommendation is that you work with individuals in multiple departments in your district or charter to define roles and establish the corresponding access for those roles. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say you have an opening for a new third grade teacher at one of your schools, and you hire the teacher. And then the question is, all right, well, what access does this teacher need? What systems does the teacher need access to? Within those systems, what level of access does the teacher need? So the idea would be with this recommendation is to have these conversations preemptively, get multiple people together to kind of hammer this out. All right, when we hire a third grade teacher, what access do they need? Now, here's the idea. Rather than a job title, so the job title being third grade elementary teacher, you need to align job titles with corresponding job roles. A role is different from a title in that a role describes the level of access someone would have. So, for example, your third grade teacher that you just hired might be assigned the role of elementary teacher. And in your district or charter school, you guys have decided that, all right, if you're an elementary teacher in this district or charter, you're going to need certain levels of access to our student information system. You're going to need an account in our testing software. You're going to need access to these other systems. That's the goal with this defining job roles. The benefit of this is that HR, who has quite a bit of information about a person's job responsibilities, is not equipped to have the ability to grant access. IT does have the ability to grant access, but sometimes they don't always have information about what the person's job responsibilities are. So that's the key piece of bringing multiple people together to have these conversations. All right, so here's an example workflow based on that conversation we just had about defining roles that an employee might fill. So first step, an employee is hired. The next step is the role is assigned. We know the job description, but work has happened on, preemptively to document what is meant when a person is hired in this position. Well, they are assigned a certain role. That role is communicated to access grantors meaning the people who can create and update the accounts, which is usually going to be IT. And then the access is granted based on the assigned role. Here's a really similar workflow, but this is a often missed piece of access control management, which is an employee that is not a new employee, but is rather changing their role within the organization. So maybe this is a classroom teacher that became a principal, or maybe this is someone who was working in IT and now they are working as a teacher in a school. This is a big one. That new role needs to be communicated to the people who can grant access. And then ultimately that access needs to be changed based on the new role. All right, here's our next recommendation. Establish strong communication between people who know about role changes. For example, HR. HR is going to know when someone is hired. They're going to know when someone is terminated, and they're even going to know when there is a change in position. So the key is to establish strong communication between those people and the people who grant or revoke access, such as IT. And I would like to acknowledge that I realize that in small districts or in charter schools, you might not have a full HR department and an IT department, but the idea is the same. People who know about role changes need to tell the people who can make the access changes. All right, our next recommendation is to make sure to include all your systems in your offboarding process. So this can be a big task because, as you know, in education, we work with a lot of different systems. There's a system to manage there's the student information system, then there's like Google Workspace or Microsoft, and then you might have another system that is where you document, discipline issues, and there's another system where you use for your testing platform. So it can be really tricky. One little tip, and this came from folks in districts and charter schools, is to utilize single sign-on to your advantage, not only while the employee is working for you, but also when they leave. So an example of this would be if you're using single sign-on for 8 different applications, then once you revoke access to the original program that sort of like ties all the single sign-on together, then you also remove access to those other systems as well. So that's a nice little tip for you to help you kind of revoke that access more thoroughly. All right, let's talk a little bit about documentation. So I like to say that a good offboarding system is automated as much as possible and documented as much as possible. So you are best off, the more documentation you have and the better it's like shared with employees in your district and charter, the better off you'll be. You'll want to document not only your policies and procedures, but you'll also want to make sure that those are official and clear. And this will also give you backing for when you need to make difficult decisions. I heard of an example of an employee that had been working for a school district for a really long time. This was a pretty small district where it was kind of like everyone knew everyone. the employee left, they retired, but they stayed on in a volunteer capacity. So they were still really involved in the school. And this employee was really upset about the idea of having their access revoked to some of the systems because in their mind, they're still supporting students as a volunteer. They wanted access to those systems. So one thing that can support you when you're making a difficult decision like that is to just say, I'm sorry, but these are our policies and procedures. I know you're interested in having greater access, but this is the policy that we've landed on. All right, let's touch on managing access. Again, wherever possible, automating access granting and revoking is ideal. However, I fully acknowledge that this is like a fully automated program is not common. Some of the bigger districts are moving towards more automation, but for small districts, a lot of the process of granting access and revoking access is unfortunately a really manual process, which is where that documentation comes into play. But to whatever extent possible, automation is great. This helps reduce errors. It also like speeds things up. It ensures that you have a timely truncation to access. And one of the best ways you can do this, even if you're not, paying or developing an external system just for automation, is by using organizational units or containers to automate access in Active Directory or in the Google Admin Console. So I'm going to show you here a couple of OU, organizational unit structures, that are recommended by Amplify IT, and which I personally recommend as well. Specifically, let's look at this one on the right. So this is a really cool recommendation. If you create an organizational unit in your Google Admin Console, you can create an offboarding organizational unit, and perhaps it has two different groups underneath it, staff and students. One thing that we've seen people find success with is creating this offboarding organizational unit. When an employee is about to leave, so maybe it's a week before their departure or a month before their departure, something like that, then they'll drag the employee or move the employee into this OU. Well, there are certain settings assigned with this OU. For example, you might choose to enable the Google Takeout feature for these employees. And then ultimately, when it's time, then you can move that same employee to a different OU, which is, suspended or archived or something like that, where the account still exists, but all of the settings that are applied under this organizational unit restrict all access. This is really a handy way to manage things. And it also allows you to not full on delete an account until you're ready. You can suspend it, and then when you're ready, you can actually delete the account. All right, that's it. Hope this was helpful, and we just really appreciate you guys and all the work you do. Thanks. Please reach out if you have any questions at privacy@schools.utah.gov.